Good morning. Today is Wednesday, June 22nd, and this is Devotions from St. Paul Evangelical Lutheran Church in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I'm going to take a passage from the book of Galatians today, a letter that Paul wrote, and it talks about the law and faith, a common theme for Paul, and how they interact to help us form our relationship with Jesus. So this is from the 3rd chapter of the book of Galatians. Now before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian. For in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. Paul tells us that we live under the law. We have always lived under the law, and that therefore the law has imprisoned us and guarded us. Now think about that, imprisoned and guarded. Imprisoned because it told us how to live. Imprisoned because it gave penalties for violating the law. But guarded because it told us how to live. It told us the right way to live. The fact that we were not able to meet that standard doesn't mean that the law was not a good thing. It just meant that people were under the reign of sin, and as Paul said, under the reign of the flesh. But when Christ came, he brought this idea of faith. And because we can now be justified with Christ by faith, we're no longer subject to the law. Now, in many places, Paul says there's no reason to ignore the law, that we should still try to follow the law, but we are not subject to it. We are subject to faith. And if you believe, you are a child of God. He says that in this passage. He says that if you're baptized in Christ, that you are now clothed in Christ. And so you now are an heir with Christ and an heir of the promise. Now the last passage, the last verse in this passage is very interesting to me. So I want to highlight it just a little bit. I'm going to read it again. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. This idea of promise is important. So I went back to Genesis and I read a little bit to see exactly what this promise to Abraham was. And it seems that there were two. One that is very obvious in the reading is the physical promise of the land of Canaan. God said to Abram at the time actually, that your descendants will inherit this land. And it was a vast land. It was from Egypt to the Euphrates River. It was huge. And Abraham was by himself at that time. He and Sarai, they did not even have children. He did have flocks and herds and servants and whatnot, but no children. So the first and the physical promise was the land. But the second promise was faith. It says, and Abram believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now righteousness is another way of saying right relationship with God. So it was Abram's faith that gave him that right relationship. Now this is the same thing that Paul is talking about to the Galatians. It is our faith that gives us a right relationship with Christ. It makes us heir to the promise, the same promise that Abram was subject to, that was heir to when he believed God. Now Paul started his passage with the law and ends it with the promise and with faith. But it's interesting to me that the promise to Abram of a right relationship based on faith came more than 400 years before the physical law was given to Moses when they were on Mount Sinai. And so we see this whole circle come around, and it comes back to this idea of faith and right relationship. Today, I hope you'll think about your faith and understand that your faith in Jesus Christ, just like my faith in Jesus Christ, gives us a right relationship with Christ. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't work at it. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't put in the effort. It doesn't mean that we ought to think about it, that we ought to study, and that we ought to be devoted to Christ. But it does mean that the relationship is based upon faith in Christ and nothing else. That's an important idea for us. It gives us that relationship with Christ. I think it's important for me to do all the things I can to support that relationship. But it is such a blessing to know that the relationship is based on faith and not what I do. And that is the very promise of God, given first to Abraham and now to all of us through Jesus Christ. I hope you will think on this and pray on this and see what you can come up with to further your relationship with Jesus Christ as well. Thank you.